Thank you all for coming along. My name's Jock Serong and welcome to Blarney Books. It's lovely to be here and we've got a really good little schedule for you this afternoon. This is, I think, Joe and Dean's first ever double header on a Saturday Arvo. So I'm chatting with Richard Walter, who's beside me here, about his beautiful collection of poetry called Oddfellows. Thereafter, if you cast your eyes into the green room, which is open in this venue, you'll see Robert Gott, who will be talking to Michael Winkler at 5. We'll have a little break in between, so we hope you'll stay around for both events. And Dean has got his bar operating, as is the ordinary course of events, so there'll be time to grab a glass of wine or something in between and make yourselves comfortable. Okay, so the way that we always kick off events here at Blarney is that we acknowledge that we're on the land of the Gunditj, Murra and Peak-Wurrung people, and that's a very important recognition at the start of any gathering in Port Fairy. So there's that. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to take you through a little bit of Richard's backstory because it's fascinating. It's always interesting to know how a poet has come to do what they do, and in Richard's case, it's extremely unconventional. Richard is, I had to ask about this career, but Richard has been a regional planner. I was about to say town planner, which is what I'm not supposed to say, because a regional planner is a far more wondrous creature. Richard studied in the US under a guy called Ian McCarg, who, if we've got time, we should talk about because he's fascinating. He's been a VCAT member, he's been the chair of the Hamilton and Alexandra College Council, he's been chair of the Green Triangle Council for Regional Development, which I think, were you the inaugural chair of that?
No, I was on the first. You're on.
I think you're going.
Is that on?
Yeah.
I was on the board, the overall board that we set up, and that was back in, I think, 1982. And then took over as chairman after the first chairman stepped down.
Okay.
And did that job for another 8 years or thereabouts, something like that. And then the government closed us down, so we were starting to get a bit dangerous, I think.
Revolutionary body. Richard is also, much more importantly than any of these things, the husband of Ruth for 57 years. Yes. And Ruth, many of you in the room already know, but for those of you who don't already know, is a very prominent and accomplished botanical artist who work's really worth checking out. I think there's not only children of Richard and Ruth in the room, but in fact grandchildren as well, so hello to all of you. Okay, and the sort of jumping off point from all of that history into Richard's poetry is that Richard has a genuine love of this region. He's very interested in the idea of regions, I think it's fair to say, and their potential, but also our region in particular.
True.
Can you take us through a little bit of that history, Richard, as to how you've sort of come to love the place?
Well, excuse me. I think it stems from childhood, growing up in the southwest, at Hamilton in particular, in the 1940s and going into the early 50s. It was an interesting time to be a child in this world, and Pearl Harbor was just 3 months after I was born, and Dad became a fitter armourer in the Air Force, went into Northern Australia on a number of different stations there, replenishing cannons and on aircraft. My uncle went off to the war as aircrew and did the trip across the Pacific through to Canada as part of the Empire flying scheme, flight training scheme. And while there, they discovered he had an inner ear issue and couldn't become part of flight crew. And so they said, well, you're on this trip now, you're going to continue and go right through to Britain. And he spent the war in RAF headquarters at Kodak House in London for 5 years. And so that sort of broadened our horizons early on, and things happened from there on. But I think the regional issue came from just a desire to, it's not that I have anything against cities, but I think they're a great place and a real mixing of ideas and the ferment of society. But good things can also happen in regional areas. And there are good people living in the regions, and they have insights that aren't always available to those in cities. And as time went on, I was involved in a lot of community organisations. It became apparent that, or it seemed to us out here, that if things weren't being done in Melbourne, they shouldn't be done in regional areas anyway, or shouldn't happen in regional areas unless they're being done in Melbourne as well. And it was just this preponderance of the direction of policy and the money that followed from it, we felt going in an undue way to cities, to the neglect of the regions. And that was basically behind it. And I thought, well, what I can do is to try and help regional organisations to get going and help regional people to achieve some of those things that might help. Sorry, Jeff.
So, Richard, at some point you've devoted all of that energy and intellect to your formal career in the regions. At some point you must have been turning your thought and your energy to writing poetry and to your art. Is that something that had been going on the whole time simultaneously, or did that kind of emerge over the years?
The art part of it was, I've always enjoyed sketching, and so whenever we travelled or had some time, I'd always have a sketchbook and a pen or a pencil and do some sketching. And the poetry came later, I think, in the sense that I'd always been interested in reading poetry, and I started collecting poems of individual poets and anthologies of poems. But that really, I think, started much earlier when we were at school. As kids in primary school at Grey Street, and the state produced these school readers for each year level. And they were republished by the Victorian Printing Office in 1987, and as a boxed set from 1 to 8. And I got a copy of that, or a box of those books, and it rekindled a whole lot of memories for us, for both Ruth and myself, of things, bits of literature, English literature, but also a quarter of the content had to be Australian. It was mandated, that was required when they were written, I think, back in 1928 and 30. And the last time the whole group set were being used, I understand, in the schools was just before 1950. But the year 5, or the 5 and 6 books, went on through much of the 50s. And they weren't specifically written for children, but because they were extracts from literature, a wide range of literature. And apart from the very early 1 and 2 books, perhaps, the rest was really taking slabs out of the available literature. And so we were exposed as children growing up in those years to a very wide vocabulary. It wasn't played down, and the breadth of writing that we were exposed to, I think, was quite broad. And that was probably the start of it, and as far as I was concerned. And then later on, we had a tennis group that played tennis for 35 years together on a Saturday afternoon. Would still be there this afternoon if it was on, but some of us are no longer here.
So despite the gale.
Despite the gale, yes. And at one time, always at the start of the season, the person who was one of our 3 hosts, they were all tennis courts on properties, would send out an invitation, and that was it was I suppose you'd call it doggerel, and my reply was equally canine. It did start a habit of putting things in that form in writing, and it followed on from there.
But that sort of takes me to an interesting point about you, that you have this ability as an artist and you have this ability with poetry. When you encounter something, around us in the landscape or whatever it might be. How do you decide which way to respond? How do you know whether something is an image or a set of words?
The thing I do at the time is the first thing I go to is the sketchbook, because that's the thing that I can't do once I leave the site with the same purpose. That way I can remember things broadly, but I like to do something while I'm there. And the one instance, but then it's the process of walking through the landscape or walking on the beach early in the mornings, or it might be just a passing comment someone makes that sticks. And when you mix with farmers, they're people who spend a lot of time alone and are often some of our most succinct philosophers, I think. They manage to, come up with some quite concise summaries of things that just ring bells. And the one thing that comes to mind today is that one of the little haikus in here called Covered was an expression that one of our bike riding group in the morning, an 84-year-old ex-homer, John Gubbins by name, who arrived one morning and said, "Now we've got to wear these nose bags," while COVID was on, you see. And so the little haiku that's called Covered came from just that expression. It's just an example of how things happen. That I think we grab and collect bits and pieces where we go. It might be something on the ground, it might be something we see, it might be an imprint on the beach, it might be a group of people doing something, or animals doing something.
And are these things, are they rumbling around in your head for a period of time before they're committed to paper?
Sometimes, yes, quite often. Since I've been trying to write some poetry, though, of course, I tend to hurry home to a notebook or try and have something with me to write an idea on, because it's very frustrating when you've had an interesting experience or you've noticed something, and you wake up the next morning and think, what the heck was it? And that can happen very particularly at this age.
So you're not one of these people who writes on sticky notes on the steering wheel at 100 k's an hour?
No, I don't do that, but I'm not averse to stopping by the side of the road.
Much safer mode. So there must be, I imagine, a lot more verse that you have compiled over recent years than is in Oddfellows. How did you start to narrow it down, and how did you have the sense that there was a collection forming?
I think it was the COVID and the experience of the lockdown over the last 18 months or so. Because as someone once said, or many people have said probably, it's not until we have these constraints placed on us where we can't do things that we really find out what it is we'd like to do. And it seemed very easy for me to say, well, here we are, no social engagements, we can't even have friends in, we're stuck here, we need to do something with the time and place, and so I started doing that. And part of it was taking this online writing program with a chap called Adam Wyeth, who is an Englishman now that has lived in Ireland for some years as a young man, and he has an associate position with one of the theatres in Dublin. But along the way, he's a very accomplished poet himself. He's a reader, a close reader, as Seamus Heaney called him, of poetry, and writes essays and plays, and several of his plays have been produced not only in Ireland but on the continent and in Britain as well.
So there must have been a point, if I think back to sort of March last year, when I was coming in here and getting jigsaws from Jo, and I was worried she was going to run out of jigsaws, that none of us really knew how open-ended that situation was. And so you're building a project in a small way at first by doing the course, and you knew that you had some collected poetry behind you. It must have been hard to know the scale of what it was you were embarking on.
Well, I wasn't embarking on a book.
Right.
I was embarking on a writing program, it only became apparent that perhaps there might be something there that we could put together just as a record of some time spent, as it were. And the stuff that had been done before that, some of which I've kept, some of which had previously been published in a local anthology that Brian Edwards was that I acknowledge in the acknowledgements at the beginning of this book. And Brian, I think it's influenced a lot of people in the district.
Certainly Joe and
with
I.
their writing. Yes.
You should explain a bit more about Brian, I guess.
Yes, well, Brian was an academic in literature at Deakin University in Geelong. It turns out that Brian and I were at residential college at uni, in residence in Queens, back in the late 50s, early 60s. And he was and still is a nice fellow. He was, used to play a very good game of cricket, and he was a good footballer.
Good fisherman too.
Good fisherman, very good fisherman, and an excellent golfer with a bag of sticks. But he does it very well. And he also writes. He writes poetry, literary criticism. He analyses literature in a big way, and he has some favourite authors that he follows, and a really interesting man who's contributed a lot to the development of literary pursuits in and around the state, I think, and probably further. Yeah.
So at some stage you must have moved to a phase where you were bringing some of your poems into a collection and other ones you're casting aside. How are those? Are they emotional decisions? Are they ruthless intellectual decisions?
I wouldn't call them emotional decisions. You do get to have a sense of ownership of your writing. I agree with that element of it, but some things that became quite apparent during the course of that quite intense sort of response to a 10 sort of module program that I was doing.
Right.
They just wouldn't go any further.
Yeah. That sounds ruthless.
But there are other things that sometimes there was elements of things I'd done in the past that I took and then developed some more. And so it was a mix of those things, John.
Okay. So there are, I think, were there 3 sections to the book?
Oh, there's, I think 5.
Oh, okay.
But
yes. Oh, there are 2.
It's really it was just for me a way of not necessarily trying to group similar things, but break them up a little bit, make it a little bit more of an interesting read.
Yeah.
And some of the illustrations, I think, help to do that without being direct subjects of poems particularly.
Yeah. No, I remember now, the reason I was thinking of 3 was because as I moved through the book, I had a sense of 3 phases, that you were talking a lot early on about birds, and in particular wading birds and shorebirds. Then you sort of moved into talking about landforms like the island and other places around the town. And then towards the back of the book, we're dealing more with people. I was amazed early on that there was barely a mention of a human being. It was very much poetry about nature, and then it evolved towards people as it went along. Was that sort of a conscious arc, or was that just the way things felt?
It was probably more a case of I didn't feel comfortable writing about people.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm not sure if I am now, really, but I've always had a great love of birds and bird watching.
Yeah.
And coming here, to live here 17 years ago, and we overlooked the Moyne, and it's a section of the Moyne that's tidal, and when the tide goes out, the wading birds come in, and then the tide comes back in again. And so it's constantly changing, and that became an object of interest, and I started making notes about those things. A lot of birdos count birds or make lists of how many birds they see, but I found more interest in watching their behaviour and then taking notes from that sort of thing, or just thinking about it.
Well, that explains a bit to me now, because the thing that struck me was that you weren't writing about, you know, the great seabirds or the migratory birds or the raptors or any. It was these kind of unsung birds that don't really have a voice often in literature. But there you go, they're out the front of your house and that's your interest.
Yes.
We should dig into a few of the poems specifically. I think Richard and I had a coffee and a chat about which ones to select for the purposes of talking today. And it's been a very, very difficult selection, I can assure you. So I've tried to establish a little cross-section across the collection here. I hope I've done Richard justice in asking for these ones, but we'll find out. Okay, the Sentinel. Firstly, can you tell us what is the Sentinel about, just before you read it to us as well?
Well, there's usually a story behind all the poems. It mightn't be a long story, but there's some germ of an idea or an event that's triggered it. And the Sentinel is about the Night Heron. It's a wonderful bird. It's a bird that a lot of people don't know a lot about or see much, but come to Port Fairy and they're in front of you. Take a walk along the wharf and they're still there in front of you, and you look up in the tree and they're roosting in the tree. So anywhere around the river you'll see night herons most of the year, but particularly when the fishing season's on and the boats are coming in with the catch and it's an easy feed. So, would you like me to read?
Yes, please.
Forget my shaking of the mic. It's just to get the visual effect of a wind. And
Got a whole Michael book, pretty good.
no, I think to do it. Shuttered against the moonlight of the ebbing tide, the night heron transits the estuary with the rhythm of a flying fox, alighting on a favoured rock where it watches and waits, feathered basilisk. Replenished at night's end, the bird retraces its path in the pre-dawn gloom, its progress marked by an eerie quack, until rising above the village and the wharf, it settles in the willow myrtle's roost. There is no truce for the bluefin tuna. Fishermen have returned from the continental shelf, winched their boats from the water and cleaned the catch. Steadfast night heron watches from a bollard. Hunched and alert, its black-crowned head nestled in rufous wings, the capuchin sentinel of the morn waits. When it strikes, in a moment it is up and away, a crimson veil streaming from the choicest offcut held in its gleaming beak.
Beautiful. Now, there's so much I'm interested in here, but in particular, I had to look up basilisk.
It's a good word, isn't
Terrible confession. Yes.
I had to look it up too.
And the thing is, it changes the whole nature of the poem, because they're quite a malevolent thing.
They are, and,
Yeah.
and I've noticed just recently, as a result of some watching we've been doing, that Harry Potter has made it a real thing for us. And so basilisks now have a currency that is much more current than perhaps it was a few years ago.
You're ahead of the curve. So a reptile that I think mythologically can kill or paralyse with its stare?
Certainly malevolent.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about night herons in a whole different way. But also the way you talk in the poem about the routine of the bird figuring out that the fishermen are coming in and cleaning their catch and that there'll be an easy offcut from that, which reminded me of the very same thing that the stingray is doing under the wharf, that they seem to become sort of...
Symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, beautiful. And it's very much, I mean, that's, as a location, very much of the wharves, isn't it? Because when you mentioned them on the bollards, and that's how I would see a night heron, is on that old woodwork. Yeah. Should we move to Island Easter Saturday? This one's a bit longer, and it's. I think this really captures, particularly this afternoon, this kind of atmosphere.
Yes,
Who would leave a phone on? Thank you, Bob.
unlike last Easter Saturday, the most recent one, it's obviously urgent.
It's Richard's phone.
Easter Saturday this year was a wonderful day. It was a day to go swimming, but Easter last year, during the lockdown, was a very wild day. So that's really where this came from. The island, Easter Saturday. Shafts of sunlight catch wave crests as the aquamarine swells become spray and vapour against the 30,000-year-old basalt reefs and coastline. Wind and waves united in a demonic chorus, and we are mute. Chestnut teal shelter behind the causeway, and broken waves pour through the passage. We struggle to stay upright as the chop of the incoming tide slops over the training wall. There is a stench of rotting kelp carried on the wind. Everything is fixed and upright, is moving, mobile creatures undercover coupling. 20,000 short-tailed shearwaters left their burrows for the East Asian flyway and the North Pacific. And here, on the island, the scavenger gulls, ibis, and ragged-winged ravens clean up the immature mutton birds killed by predatory cats, rats, and foxes. Black wallabies cluster in the few Norfolk Island pines and shrubs, grazing the green pick, their dark chocolate coats as dense as fur seals. And a echidna burrows into the sandbank with his powerful claws. Few would tangle with his coat of sharp yellow spikes. At the island's southernmost point, the now automatic lighthouse and navigation beacons warn sailors of reefs and mark entry to the river and the town. This is also the site of the first attempt to create a bay whaling venture. Much has been removed, the infrastructure and vats for scrap, the building stones for use elsewhere, and whale songs echo the carnage of sealers and whalers drowned and enterprises that failed. Desolate now, the site of the lighthouse keeper's cottage and outbuildings reminds us of supplies by boat, so close to the mainland. Remnants of self-reliance, garlic, bitter wild rocket, daffodils and jonquils mark the garden, harbingers in many cultures of good fortune and in some of death.
Thank you. I loved towards the end of that poem the familiarity that you have with that spot, because we've all been out there, but the actual blocks weighing tons and tons of that lighthouse keeper's cottage are all gone and the whole thing's eradicated, and yet the garden persists.
Yes.
It's a marvellous thing, isn't it? You go out there and there's garlic stalks and all these different bulbs.
Yes.
What about what's happening earlier in the poem with the perspective? You say we struggle to stay upright. Is that walkers in the wind?
Yes.
Right, okay.
It was really wild, and we did walk that day.
Right.
And you knew you were trying to stay upright.
Yeah, and then a little bit further on, everything fixed and upright is moving. Mobile creatures undercover coupling. What's going on there?
Well, there's a lot of burrowing animals out there, and not just the mutton birds, there's others as well. And it's a bit like a brownout in a city. Birth rate increases in those times. 9 months time.
No television.
Just a thought.
Yeah. And then you reveal a little bit of your environmental consciousness about the place with the reference to cats, rats and foxes, which is a constant issue out there.
Yes.
Yeah. It's lovely. All right, I'm going to move you on to Oddfellows itself. I think in music verbiage we would call this the title track.
Title track. A cover, they call it, when someone else plays it. Is that?
Yes, yeah.
I should be getting someone else to play this one. Yes, I don't have a lot of inanimate objects that are friends, but the bridge is one of them. Because when I wake up in the morning, it's the first thing I see. It's the bridge over the mine, and I look up from the bed, and if the blind's open far enough, I can see the bridge. And so it takes an important part in our life, my life. And the other inanimate object I think of that are friends, probably books. Is the other main one. Oddfellows. In the silence of the fog-enfolded estuary, the sun shines, revealing bold vertical and horizontal strokes framed by the white-painted rails of a woodblock print. It prompts a sketch, a painting, now a lino cut. Clusters of hardwood tree trunks contained between massive beams, pierced by rusted iron bolts and a deck of planks surfaced with bitumen, become a bridge. My joints are rusty but holding. Few months of the year pass when a work crew is not out or under the bridge, slowing the ravages of rot. The repairs will never be finished. Mine are just beginning and will last while Medicare and I persist. The deck surface is cracked by stress, and the movement of heavy vehicles causes the timbers to rattle. It is a mellower rumble than the clanging aluminium notes of trailers. This skin is creased, and I snore and groan. Beneath the bridge, the waters of the ebb tide flow downstream from the productive shallows of the loch to the low productivity of the ocean. We journey towards decrepitude. At dusk, its form becomes a shuttered silhouette against the sunset estuary, reflecting fleet pulses of gold, red, purple and mauve. It is a path to activity and community, or a way to a place of refuge and reflection. At the end, a muffled rumble comes from the darkness as my friend of the dawn and evening says good night. If it is one of the last things I see, I shall be content to be by our hearth.
I love that last line. It's all pretty jocular till then. But that's quite a statement. It's interesting, isn't it, when they do works on the bridge, you suddenly realise that the township is in fact very isolated without it, and you have to drive all the way around the backside to get out of town.
As we had to while the big works.
Yeah, I remember feeling outraged. It's going to take me 8 minutes. And also people getting their bike wheels stuck in it.
Yeah, well, that was a real hassle.
Yes.
And
Has that
and
now
still
been...
is on the pedestrian paths. I mean, a lot of people from the camping ground ride bikes over the timber sections on that pedestrian track on the side, on the north side, and that's quite hazardous.
Right, yeah. But when you say, this is your inanimate friend, I think, isn't this one of the really serious jobs of poetry, that you've taken a thing that's so ubiquitous that all of us deal with every day, and I barely give it a thought, and then to see that you have a whole different sense of the beauty of this thing, and it's kind of cycles of decay and maintenance.
Yes. And visually, it changes so much with the weather, and fog morning, and it emerges out of the fog at late at night, early in the morning. It changes form, and that's interesting too.
And it's kind of workmanlike, isn't it? It's not like something passing over the Seine. It's not grand.
No,
It's pretty humble.
It is, yes. But good.
Yeah, but good. Yeah. It's a beautiful poem. All right, next up, I think, in the selections, we have Winter of Our Discontent.
Yes, this comes from a couple of things. It's about Rutledge's... Everything all right? Right?
Say what copyright was what I said. I said out of copyright a long time ago.
Oh, you're thinking of discotent, that's a rave.
I'll talk to you after. It's about Rutledge's Cutting, which is just down below Tower Hill. And at the time when I was writing it, it was a time of community concern about uncontrolled immigration into Australia. And so those two elements came into play on this. Winter of Our Discontent. In July, 7 rafts arrived in the bay, each with 1,000 or more individuals on the move, working cooperatively, exploiting the resources of this economic zone, but without visas or work permits. They had come from across the Tasman, specialist inshore fly fishers flying underwater in pursuit of prey seasonally unavailable in their own waters, just as our specialist fishers had gone to the North Pacific. Shapeshifters. On dull days, the rafts are black, ominous. Then the sun shines, transforming them to virtuous white, striving only to survive and breed the next generation. We call them fluttering shearwaters. Late in March, others come to this storm-racked coast. Small bands, exhausted, in indistinct garb, first seen on the periphery, then in the far lookers, 2 fluffy snowballs scurrying between wavelets of sand and desiccated kelp. Lack of winter food in the high country of the Southland has driven them to our shore, their own race denied them new habitat. No jobs are lost. Our sea changers and shore dwellers have gone north on the flyway to the shrinking resource of Vietnam, Korea and China. These working visitors have thrived on the insects, molluscs, worms and larvae of the cutting. 5 months on, replenished and fit, they flaunt the flashing chestnut and black glands of their breeding plumes. We call them double-banded plovers. Inoffensive fellow creatures, they ask only for the chance to earn a living for a short time until they return home. For us, it is beauty and diversity they lend to our cosseted lives.
Now, Richard, is that a political poem?
You could say it has elements of politics in it. Jock, yes.
I just wasn't sure how sort of...
I felt stronger about it a little while ago. But, yeah.
The other thing that it called to mind for me was that I think, particularly in busy times in Port Fairy, the place sometimes seems like a commodity. Like we've developed a product that we're selling to visitors, and that it's all about the value of the houses or the quality of the coffee or whatever it might be. And the poems like that you're writing, you're reminding us that it's a natural world, and that there's these migratory cycles going on and biological cycles going on that are completely separate to the commercial side of the town. Is that something that you dwell on a bit when you write poems?
Yes, I think so. And I mean, if I was in marketing, I think I'd probably be having to start to think about how we keep it secret.
Go the other way.
Yeah.
All right, so the last of these, I'm really glad that we've saved this one for the last of the poems we've selected, because I think it's really special. And to me, this is Richard moving very firmly towards writing about people and in a very, very affecting way. I better let you introduce it beyond that, Richard, I think.
Good, Jock. As soon as I managed to find the page.
What have I got? 63.
I do have it marked, but I'm trying to protect the mic as well. When the shakes get so bad, even though I wrote it myself, it's sometimes hard to read it. Yes, I don't think I need to say anything by way of introduction. Good. It's called An Ending. She released him from her embrace as the boy and his father drove off to the city. He could see his mum getting smaller, waving in the mirror. The resident master showed them to the dormitory he would share with 5 other boys his own age, all new to the school. His clothes unpacked, they had a cup of tea, scones, jam and cream with the other families. After a walk through the grounds and a talk at the front gate, it was time to say goodbye. For the first time, his father held out his right hand and they shook, trying to smile but with tears welling in their eyes. Before, they had hugged or kissed, but here they were on show. I shall get a page turner next time. I have to do this again.
I'm sure the service I got.
There we go. Can you remember where we're up to? The father returned to the car and his son walked around the oval before going in, each having a good ball at their loss and the change that had taken place. His care had passed to the school and staff. The parents were welcome to visit their son at home in his new setting, but by arrangement. Daily chats over meals were replaced by a much anticipated exchange of letters once a week and visits home in the school holidays. Their lives apart were another world, not all of which was shared. Once the moment had passed, some events didn't bear retelling.
Now the boy's you,
Yes.
and down through your enormous family life and decades of happy relationships, that moment obviously still burns pretty brightly for you.
Well, it's one of the things I've noticed about writing of any sort, but particularly with poetry. It's only when you sit down and start writing that a whole lot of other things come back into your mind. I first noticed it when the boys would come home and talk about how many, generations or a little bit about the family history. They had an exercise to do at school and had to report back. And we'd start telling them things about our respective families and they had to pull us up because once you start, you keep remembering other things. And we were giving too much information. They wanted a few dates, a couple of generations, and that's the answer to that question. But, and so that's continued as I sit, and one of the things I learned to do during this thing, which you know very well, during COVID and the writing exercises, is you have to write every day. You need to just start off quite fast and just write for a quarter of an hour, fill a page or two with just whatever comes into your mind. And it's amazing what comes from those sorts of episodes. And this was another way in which some of that stuff comes to mind.
So had that incident, of parting with your father, had that been a stone in your shoe all of these years and you finally wrote it out? Or have you written about it before and talked about it before?
No, I haven't. It wasn't a stone in my shoe. I got over it. Probably the next day. Because I enjoyed school.
Did you?
Yeah, and so that was fine. But and then I worked in the same office as my father for 33 years, in part at least. So I wasn't having any luck or any lack of father figures in my life.
Well, the poem reads very differently. It feels like a real severance.
Well, it was at the time.
Yeah. All right, well, that brings us to the end of the journey through Oddfellows, which is, of course, for sale just over there behind us all. I urge you all to buy multiple copies. And I'm thinking about time, Joe. Would you like us to take some questions now, or do we need to give everybody a bit of time for a break between, or what would you like?
Questions now while you're on a roll.
Yeah, okay, sure. Would anyone like to ask Richard a question about the poems?
Or anything. Well,
You can read another one. It's not a compulsory activity, by the way. Not very much.
Yes.
Richard, when did you start writing poems?
In a constant, when I say constant, in a regular way, probably about, when did Brian? When we came here 17 years ago, and we fairly early on got involved with Brian Edwards' writing group that he had, and people would bring along examples of their work to monthly meetings and read them.
That was about 08, I reckon, wasn't it?
About that, about 2008, and from then on I was writing things reasonably regularly.
And did you, so from when you started to now, did you, have you noticed that your poems to you become more, should I say, better in your mind?
I think it's what I've also found in the last few years in particular is that things only improve by going back into them and editing in them, cutting down, writing again and again and again. And that's, I think, the change that takes place.
Yeah, thank you.
Just on that piece of advice, Richard, should I go back and teach my poetry class 10 or 15 more times?
At least, John, you should keep doing it. It was a great fun.
Kate, did you have a question?
Yeah, Richard, from memory, you have a number of poems that are in a haiku form.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you just talk about, like, did you just decide I'll try and express these in a haiku with the disciplines of that form, or did you did it work the other way around, that this just seemed to be the best form? You know, talk about the constraints of that form and what it does for your crystallising your expression.
Yes. I had an interest in haiku from just reading other poems and hearing people talk about poetry. And the haiku form, for those of you who are not familiar with it, I'm sure most of you are, but it's 17 syllables in the traditional form in 3 lines, 5, 7 and 5. And it's a Japanese form, obviously. And I quite enjoy it. At one stage I made a resolution to write a haiku a day, and I haven't done that, but I've written a few. And there's one here I particularly like, which is the one called Burnt Sienna, and
Coming up. Talk among yourselves.
Oh, thanks, John. And it's self-explanatory, I think. Kimberley shelters, dreamtime, song lines, ancient art, old fella yarns, new light. And the great thing about haikus, I think, is they're often, well, in the traditional form, they're nature-related. They often have a seasonal influence, but certainly quite a specific reference to nature in one form or other. And I think they're capable of saying a lot with a few words.
All right, we might need to wrap up there, I think, but thank you all for listening. And Richard, thank you so much for your thoughts about the book. It's fascinating, and yeah, I really recommend this very, very highly. It's a wonderful account of our town and our region. And sorry. Yeah.
I will ask a bit more about the illustration setting.
Good question. Yes, yeah.
Yes.
You're quite right.
Thanks, Maureen. Maureen happens to run the sketching group with and we're both members of that group, obviously. And she does a great job in encouraging everyone to draw more and sketch more, and I would join her in that. It's a great pastime. But I just find it's a way of remembering where we go. When we've travelled, as I said earlier, I take a sketchbook and a pen, pencil. I started with a pencil, but it got very messy, and so now it's a pen which doesn't rub and leave a mess, and you've got a reasonably. I find, particularly now, but I draw many lines, but something seems to still emerge. It's not just one line that's corrected. If you can't get it correct, you keep on doing it. And things come out of that process, and that's as big a joy as writing for me.
And in the book, most of the illustrations though are
There
cuts
are-
and prints, aren't they?
There are several of them are liner cuts, right? Yes, and I came to that. We did one at school, I think I remember, once in primary school. But yes, I've started doing some printmaking.
Including the bridge, which really lends itself to
Yes,
liner cuts.
well, that was a sketch I did on a Sunday afternoon, just going up to the other side of the bridge and sitting just off the path from the Botanic Gardens there, and just took a section of the bridge and did a pencil sketch, which is still in the sketchbook, and that became the base for a liner cut some years later. So, could I just say thank you to Joe for making this space available and for inviting me to come here and do this with Jock, and also thanks Jock for treating me so kindly and looking after me, and above all, thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many people turn up, and when I first got up here into these big chairs and this fairyland, and I'd often sat where you are looking up at this and thought, what a wonderful, what do they call it? It's
Ambience.
the ambience is excellent. That's quite right. And could you like to take up poetry?
You're bringing to poetry.
But when I first came up here and looked out, it started to look more and more like Rod Laver Arena. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Joe.